We should start with the facts. Marxism has failed. Only 4 of the 34 long term Marxist Leninist states still exist today, with all of them having liberalized to notable degrees throughout the last 50 or so years. Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Benin, and more fell under a multitude of pressures compounded by mass popular protests throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, and so communism was brought to an end. To understand why communism failed, first we need to analyze the basis of Marxism and the ideas that underlie its center. In this video, I'll be covering the misapprehensions suffered by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in their theories surrounding the relationships between history, private property, and the state, as well as Marxism's counterproductive and intellectually backwards ideal of a centrally planned economic system. What needs to be covered first is Friedrich Engels' erroneous understanding of social history. Friedrich Engels argues in The Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State that small, kin based communities emerged first in history in the form of primitive communism, without private property, communal ownership of resources, no state, no social classes, and no class conflict. From this period, private property and class society emerge. Subsequently, Neolithic societies emerge based on agriculture, as does private property. Engels' perception of historical development, however, is blatantly incorrect. His argument that in primitive societies land and resources were collectively owned holds no merit. Forager societies, including the Aceh, allowed for our modern standard of private property rights, not simply mere personal property. Beyond simple bows, axes, and cooking tools, which were individually owned, meat distribution was based on private individual ownership. The Shoshone and Andaman Islanders established individual private ownership over productive resources such as bird nests, trees, or land, as well as other natural resources. If an Andaman Islander found a tree and informed his buddies about it, the tree was his and his alone. The Bear Lake Athabascans owned beaver dens and fishing sites on an individual basis as well, not communally or by kinship groups. The Degitan of Alaska, the Northern Paiute, and the Enle had similar rules as all of the other aforementioned tribes. According to the economist Frederick L. Pryor, roughly three-quarters of ancient hunter-gatherer societies already had recognized private property ownership. If Engels' theory of private property is incorrect, then his theory of statehood can't be correct either, as the theory laid forward by Engels proposes the notion that the state emerges as the upholder of the propertied class. The state, according to Engels, would be emergent from class antagonism and be made to reinforce the ruling economic class's wishes to maintain control over the means of production. The Hiwi of Venezuela had hierarchical food distributions based on individual effort and social alliances, yet they had no formal state. The Natufians, a pre agricultural society in the Levant, had heavy wealth stratification but no structured state apparatus to enforce class rule. The early Hawaiian chiefdoms had complex political structures before they fully developed private property systems, where chiefs controlled land but redistribution was based on kinship obligations rather than capitalist style exploitation. And African groups, such as the Ashanti Empire, had strong governance but no clear economic class oppression. Social hierarchy just revolved around lineage rather than private ownership. Alongside the collapse of Engels' theory of the state accompanies the collapse of the predictive power of Marxism. Engels believed that communities such as the Ake were cooperating naturally, and that this is why they engaged in communal ownership, while the emergence of private property and class stratification sort of corrupted human relations. This is, again, laughable. The Ake's communal sharing was driven by a necessity, not altruism. The moment somebody became a burden, a widow, an orphan, a sick child, they were abandoned or killed. Communal ownership was strategic insurance against future hardship, not some innate communist ethos. Hunter gatherers were not universally communist, nor were they proto socialists in any way. They had varying degrees of property rights and social stratification, as can be seen by the very fact that different individuals from thousands upon thousands of years ago were buried with different extents of luxuries, which proves social stratification precedes Engels' predictions by a long shot. Frederick Pryor, previously mentioned, pointed out the following facts, which are impossible for Engels' theory to grapple with. While Engels argued that early human societies practiced communal ownership of land, territoriality, or the exclusive use of land, was observed in many foraging societies. For example, societies like the Kootenai had collective territoriality but no private land ownership. Private claims on land, though not always economically significant, were frequently present in foraging societies. Around 40% of territorial societies had private claims on land, and in some cases, these claims were even economically important, such as in private fishing sites or trapping areas. Engels' theory also implies that private property developed alongside the growth of productive forces. This is easily disproven by the Yagan, a foraging society with a low level of development where exclusive property rights over land and fishing areas were already established, meaning that the concept of private property isn't really tied to the development of agriculture or other high level economic practices. Engels believed that private property emerged as a result of surplus production, particularly food. However, Pryor points out the fact that in societies with abundant food sources, for example, tropical regions or places where fish or animals were plentiful year round, private food stocks were not always essential. In societies where food stocks could be gathered year round, for example, there was no need for private food stocks. The Roman gens, cited by Engels as evidence of primitive communism within his book, also contradict his own ideas. The gents were a patrician institution which were exclusive to the aristocracy and functioned primarily as a means of maintaining noble lineage and property control. Engels fails to account for the fact that the plebeians were essentially entirely excluded from the gens, or the fact that the Roman hereditary kinship groups acted primarily as a mechanism to control and centralize political power and wealth. The Roman gents, from their earliest records, were completely tied to private land ownership and inheritance laws. This wasn't an emergent property from the gens that pops up later down the road. Engels conflates the Roman gents with the kinship structures of American indigenous societies like the Iroquois. The issue with this is that the Roman gens were not exogamous, matrilineal, or clan based systems in the sense that the Iroquois system was. No, instead, the gents were based upon patrilineal descent and legal control over assets. All of this is very important, but Marxism has bigger fish to fry, such as its economic calculation problem. What is the economic calculation problem? The economic calculation problem, a mouthful, or ECP for short, is the central problem that underlies Marxism and its goals of a centrally planned economic system. The ECP posits that economies are too intricate and complex to possibly be solved by a centralized method of planning, causing efficiency to rapidly decline over time in a centralized system. Marxism responds by arguing that the ECP is a fundamental non issue, which can be solved by modern technology and theoretical advances beyond what capitalist economists of the 20th century originally envisioned. The Marxists assert that the capitalist markets do not allocate resources efficiently and that price signals are neither necessary nor sufficient for rational economic calculation, and that instead of relying on capitalism, a planned economy which employs labor time accounting, computational optimization, or democratic decision making across the entirety of society could be much better and eventually necessary for the human race. They contend that the reliance on price signals under capitalism causes inefficiency, contradictions, and crises. The boom bust cycle is mentioned by Marx as one such failure where market speculation results in overinvestment in production and underinvestment in consumption, leading to eventual collapses. They argue that the 2008 financial crisis was a perfect demonstration of how capitalist markets are prone to self destruction, which in theory should mean that the planned economic system succeeds in at least mitigating these crises. If price signals were as effective as capitalist theoreticians claimed, then why do these mass inefficiencies occur? Marxists argue that modern computational methods also render the ECP obsolete, as demonstrated even by the USSR's use of mathematical planning models in the mid 20th century. The failure of Soviet planning is attributed to bureaucratic inefficiencies and political mismanagement, not an inherent flaw in non market resource allocation. They reject the notion that only competitive markets can generate the necessary information for economic calculation, arguing instead that socialist economies can adapt by incorporating feedback mechanisms and other methods of accounting for production. However, the Marxist theory completely fails in every single respect, indisputably. Rational economic calculation requires genuine price signals derived from voluntary exchange. Prices condense vast amounts of decentralized information, efficiently accounting for relative scarcities, opportunity costs, and consumer preference. Any non market pricing mechanism is necessarily arbitrary. Planned economies, even when using computational optimization, fail to replicate market efficiency because they do not have any real exchange based pricing mechanisms for capital goods. Socialist reliance on labor time accounting or predetermined quotas, the most popular method of economic planning for Marxists, pays no mind to the subjective nature of value or the complexity of consumer preference. Despite claims that modern computing has solved the ECP or the idea that this is possible through machine learning or other mechanisms, the sheer scale of economic calculation remains intractable. A centrally planned economy must account for trillions of interdependent decisions in real time, a problem exponentially more complex than even the most advanced supercomputers can handle. It took 18 years, from 1989 to 2007, for the Chinook computer program to succeed in solving the game of checkers, utilizing hundreds of computers working in unison. Finally, in 2007, the project, ran by the University of Alberta, came to a close, with the team having found 50 trillion possible positions. Chess, however, is a game at magnitudes more complex than checkers. It's estimated that there is this number of possible chess moves which can be made. This number exceeds even the amount of particles in the observable universe by a long shot, and still is merely just a game of chess, not even remotely comparable in scale to the complexity of an economy. If a computer program can't even attempt to solve the game of chess or come close to it, what makes the Marxist believe that their centrally planned economy will be able to account for the nuances of all of human economic engagement? Sheer delusion. Economic planners also have to account for the fact that they're often using imperfect or outdated data, which will always lead to systemic misallocation. The inefficiencies of the Soviet economy, despite its mathematical planning, are prime examples of this fundamental issue. Venezuela has attempted to utilize the algorithm and failed, as did the USSR. Total factor productivity, which refers to the total economic productivity with the efficient mobilization of both labor and capital resources accounted for, was parallel under both the Tsar of Russia and Stalin in the industrial sector, while in agriculture, Stalin fell far below the total factor productivity levels of the Tsar. It should be noted that despite producing multiple times as many grain harvesters as the USSR still failed to harvest as much grain and was in fact an import dependent economy in that regard. The problem with central economies, as pointed out by Joseph S. Berliner in his journal article Innovation and Central Economic Planning, isn't just the economic calculation problem, but the issue with incentive structures that is exacerbated under command economies. Innovation in any economy requires new inputs, suppliers, and technical adaptations, but the centralized allocation system creates supply constraints. Supply constraints discourage enterprises from experimenting with new technologies. In a planned economy, inputs are allocated based on long term production plans. Enterprises will receive fixed quotas, and deviations from these allocations, such as needing new materials for an innovative product, will require bureaucratic approval, which delays implementation. In a market economy, however, prices and demand shifts signal resource allocation. A planned economy, as previously covered in depth, doesn't have this dynamic adjustment ability. And so, if an enterprise wants to introduce new innovation through new products or processes, it may not be able to receive necessary inputs to achieve this innovation because the national plan didn't succeed in anticipating such a need. Furthermore, if a factory even does succeed in innovation, if the innovation requires any specialized parts, it has to wait for central planners to adjust supply schedules to accommodate this, which could take years. If an enterprise cannot rely on a steady and flexible supply of inputs for experimentation, then they're just going to avoid innovation altogether. While communists are correct when they say that most research and development is typically heavily related to the state or funded by the state in some manner, the problem which has just been mentioned means that this doesn't even really matter in the first place, because even when new technologies are developed in centrally planned systems, attaining the necessary materials and equipment for implementation on the production level is just yet another bureaucratic hurdle. Cost based pricing, another staple of centrally planned economies, is also a failure, since pricing new products at their production cost rather than potential market values disincentivizes firms to develop new technologies, since they won't reap the financial rewards of their improvements. After Marx's death in March of 1895, Engels admitted in his introduction to Karl Marx's Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, the following. But history has shown us too to have been wrong, has revealed our point of view at that time as an illusion. It has done even more. It hasn't merely dispelled the erroneous notions we then held, it has also completely transformed the conditions under which the proletariat has to fight. The mode of struggle of 1848 is today obsolete in every respect, and this is a point which deserves closer examination on the present occasion. History has proved us wrong, and all who thought like us. It has made it clear that the state of economic development on the continent at that time was not, by a long way, ripe for the elimination of capitalist production. It has proved this by the economic revolution, which since 1848 has seized the whole of the continent and has caused big industry to take real root in France, Austria, Hungary, Poland, and recently in Russia, while it has made Germany positively an industrial country of the first rank. All on a capitalist basis, which in the year 1848, therefore, still had a great capacity for expansion. What do these excerpts mean? They mean that Marxism was wrong. History had completely disproven several fundamental original Marxist assumptions. The revolutionary predictions of Marxism had collapsed, and its methodology had failed entirely to adequately forecast historical development. Engels acknowledges that capitalism, contrary to Marxism's predictions, was not by now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, but instead flourishing, industrializing vast parts of Germany, Austria, Russia, and Poland. Engels' admission that the proletariat was too underdeveloped and that capitalism was still incomplete by the 1890s means that the Communist Manifesto's initial urgency wasn't only premature, but outright false. Engels further confesses that the Marxists were entirely incorrect in their attempts to apply the revolutionary models of the 1789 and 1830 bourgeoisie revolutions to the proletarian revolution, and even that revolutionary methods such as sudden uprisings, insurrections, and barricades against the capitalist order were now obsolete in every single respect. This is a striking admission by Engels that the revolutionary tactics, which had been at the heart of Marxism, were no longer viable whatsoever. The materialist conception of history laid out in the Communist Manifesto should have explained history scientifically and been able to predict future social development. Yet, Engels admits now, 4 months before his death, when writing this, that Marxism had ultimately misjudged the unfolding of history entirely, as well as the complexity of economic change. This was nothing short of a call to rethink the entire system on Engels' part, but it was too late, and he would die by August of 1995, a failure with a fracturing pseudo intellectual crowd of anti Western factionalists as his legacy. In the end, it wasn't capitalism, but Marxism that collapsed under the weight of contradiction.